try to address them later. Our first panelist is Huma Chughtai, who is a law, governance, gender, and human rights specialist from Pakistan. She received her LLB in law from the International Islamic University of Islamabad as one of the torchbearer women students of that institution. She also has an LLM in international law and human rights from the University of Nottingham. She's worked for the National Assembly of Pakistan as a legislative researcher in the areas of law and Sharia law, constitutional, legal, and judicial issues, women's rights and gender issues, as well as parliamentary practices, and has served in various key positions within the government and the development sector. Huma, what has Pakistan's experience been with adopting and setting up gender inclusive structures to combat organized crime?
Thank you. Greetings from Islamabad. It's a very broad-based, requires a broad-based sort of answer. Government of Pakistan has been committed towards ensuring gender inclusive policies and frameworks. We've had the policy and especially the legislative frameworks in place since the Constitution was in place. We are one of the heaviest legislated countries in the world, I would say. But issues have been in the implementation. Implementation for various reasons. Not very many women came forward because of low literacy rate. Very few skewed who came through civil services exams, through special seats in the parliament, through whatever, but they were there. And we always had those glass ceilings and glass walls which were there. We claim we had the first woman prime minister, we had the first woman governor, we had the first woman foreign minister, we had this, that, and the other. But we have had, I've done studies on the reasons behind the implementation, despite the commitment of the governments. And that have been the mindsets, the patriarchal mindset has been there. And more than that, it was the tribal mindsets, the socio-cultural mindsets to which these taboos are attached. So how did we get these women into place? How do we bring them up when there is low literacy rate? And we are, constitutionally, we have national and international commitments that we have, we stand before the international community and we commit ourselves to gender equality. And religiously also, we have had parallel legal judicial systems that we have done away with. We have had discriminatory laws that we have done away with. Yet the challenges are there, What do we do? And we've tried to have them in place. And now with the passage of time, we do see it is piece by piece that we are coming to it. And we feel that with the passage of time, leaderships amongst women are coming forward within, for instance, if you're talking about this particular criminal justice system or justice system, because justice sector does not confine itself to judges alone, but it also has lawyers, prosecutors, police. And we see that women coming forward, and taking their spaces there, despite all the taboos that are attached to these jobs, especially within the law enforcement. And we do see that they're breaking the ice, but it's a very tough situation out there. Challenges are also there when the leaderships within the political leaderships, they sort of become spineless, and they have to concede to the societal mindsets, despite even if they say we are very forward-looking and we are very, open-minded. But then they also do not take a holistic approach, and that again is a huge challenge. because then, you know, unless and until you have a holistic approach towards such policies, you will continue going in circles. So this is how I see the issues and challenges. We have to have inclusive society, we have to have inclusive legislative and policy making, and we have to have inclusive approach towards even having women. Like, for instance, we had worked when I was working even as technical advisor to Women's Parliamentary Caucus, the first of its kind, which brought together women across party lines on you know, minimum agenda. And that was also the initiative of the first woman speaker in the whole Muslim world to bring together women across party lines. And we had talked about increasing the number of women police. And we did manage to lobby, and we did manage to increase the number of not only women police. I'd written a lot about it in international press as well. We did manage to get the number increase, but we also wanted to have women police and law enforcement in combat units as well, as first responders. You know, the socio-cultural setup of Pakistan is totally different, where, you know, like even in a disaster, in a bomb blast, for instance, if a woman is stuck in some kind of this debris, she will not extend her hand to get herself out. And even a man who's there to help her as a first responder might feel shy to bring her out as well. So it is both ways. So we have to have women there. And this is what we had fought for. And eventually we did get women in anti-terrorist force. We managed and get them trained at par with their male counterparts. However smaller in number, we did get them together. We did help, you know, this to happen. And we succeeded. You know, it is how you develop that will, how you develop that narrative, and how you convince your political leaderships to agree to this. And the leaderships within the bureaucracy, I tell you, the mindsets are there within the bureaucracy as well. They exist within the judiciary, they exist between the legal fraternity, they're everywhere. Because it's us, we are all from each other. And we are the mirror image of each other. So breaking the mental blockade has been a great challenge, and it continues to be there. So that is big barrier over here. You know, our setup in this, I would say, South Asian region, you know, you also replicate good practices from each other. They say, think globally, act locally. We just cannot import things. We have to look at our local context. We have to contextualize things. And we have had, in the National Police Bureau, we have had Gender Crime Cell, which we try to strengthen a lot through GIZ. UNODC has been a great help in supporting and strengthening the processes. It has succeeded to quite a bit, like, for instance, supporting the awareness raising amongst the federal investigation agencies and women and men all, you know, in understanding the dynamics of gender inclusivity and investigation. How do you bring in human rights and gender, you know? But it's a huge challenge. I stop there.
Thank you so much. That was very insightful. And you mentioned a lot about mindsets, which I think is going to play a little bit into our next speaker, Dr. Robert Henry, who is an assistant professor at the University of Saskatchewan in the Department of Indigenous Studies and executive director of the First Nations Metis Health Research Network. Robert is a community engaged researcher looking at Indigenous street gangs and gang theories, street lifestyles, Indigenous masculinities, and much, much more. And he works closely with community partners to create knowledge mobilization outcomes that reflect community needs and wants. He's also very widely published and currently looks at the concept of survivance and its applicability within Indigenous research more broadly. Robert, you have particular insights into an intersectional approach and the role of masculinity specifically. tell us more about how that plays into the work of combating organized crime.
Good morning, Layla. Good afternoon and good evening to everybody. Depending on where you're coming from right now, as Layla quickly said, I'm just going to do this real quick to ground myself here. My name is Robert Henry. I'm an assistant professor in the Department of Indigenous Studies at the University of Saskatchewan. And for the last 15 years, I've worked closely with community partners across Canada, as well as partnerships in Aotearoa and New Zealand, to examine the understandings of street lifestyles, street gangs, and Indigenous experiences within these spaces. So one of the things is I just want to try and situate this a little bit is the question that I've continuously asked throughout my research, and that continues to drive me to begin to understand a lot of these spaces, is why are some bodies more prone to state-sanctioned surveillance? In other words, why is it that we look at criminal bodies and their behaviors, and why is the primary focus on those who are racialized and residing in low socioeconomic spaces? So this is where we need to begin to understand what is the intersectionality that race and class and gender play in examining organized crime, who's a criminal and who's a victim. It's from this space that I see the need for researchers, policymakers, and communities themselves to engage in an intersectional lens to understand how race, class, gender, for the focus of the last over the last few days, gender plays in examining crime, criminal behaviors, but also situating who is and not a victim within the spaces as well. What I want to highlight very quickly here in the next couple minutes, because I'd rather have the discussions that seem to generate a lot of energy, is that the body itself is inscribed by social spaces wherein specific bodies are more readily understood to be criminal as well as victim. The de facto status whereby specific bodies are understood to be something automatically frames how we develop policy to address crime and criminal activities. For example, specific spaces are seen as high crime areas where we then put more police resources in to stop criminal activities. However, in doing so, we ignore the same behaviors that are happening in other communities and by other bodies. The result then is an increase of presence, an increase in arrests, which then creates data that can be used to validate the surveillance because it is understood as working. Then this reaffirms social constructs of who is a criminal and where crime happens. It is this point quickly that gets us to the importance of gender and understanding gender in relation to crime, specifically the role of masculinity or masculinities within the space. When we look to organized crime, and from my points here, the crime that is associated to illegal economies and connected to street spaces, there are specific codes and conducts that individuals perform in order to get money, power, and respect, thereby increasing one's status. This performance is often focused on hypermasculine behaviors of toughness, lack of empathy, and the need of control. We have to remember here as well that it is because of gender is a socially constructed performance that different bodies are able to do this. Therefore, female sex bodies, if they want to enter the game, as Bordeaux would have it put it, need to put on the performance that will allow them to not become victims within the space, but rather engage in the space in a way that provides them with the opportunity to survive and profit where they feel they're not able to in other ways. So when I talk about this real quickly, we have to understand that because masculinity is a performance, all bodies are able to perform, but you have to have a conscious decision in order to engage in this performance. And the performance is really, when we look at street spaces, is one that violence is very much associated to it, and how or what types of violence can be used, who they can be used against, and then the sort of the justice that's allowed to also occur. So this creates the cycles of street violence that we see happening across different communities, and also associates the codes of conduct that are going through there and how we address them. I've begun to move beyond traditional criminal justice and criminological approaches that continues, specifically here in Canada, to pathologize Indigenous life worlds, and now look to examine the question of why an individual may become involved that utilizes a survivance lens. This lens focuses on examining the socio-political histories that frame criminological opportunities and how one's inclusion at times is a point of survival, resistance, and resurgence, as individuals move beyond their involvement in crime, but also move beyond other aspects, and that is to focus on the experiences as victims. But at times, it is the only option that some have to engage or make the decisions that they have had to make. What I mean by survivance is that it's a lens that where individuals who are engaged in criminal activities or experiences of violence don't always see themselves as victims to it, but that they had to experience or had to make certain decisions within their lives because it was the only, what they saw at the time was the only valid option to them. So when we look at this, we have to begin to understand and not victimize individuals to a point where they don't have a say in what's happening. And that doesn't happen all the time, but we have to begin to understand or engage with individuals who are in these spaces to ask them why, how did you become engaged? What's going on? What did you see as the benefits for being there? And again, this isn't for everybody. And I want to highlight that because when we look at sex trafficking and moving individuals outside of their communities without their control or without their knowledge or without any say, that is something very different than where I'm looking at with the idea of survivance, where individuals who are engaged in street spaces, those who are engaged in the criminal behaviors themselves, for a lot of times, sometimes the theoretical understandings of what's happening positions them that they have no decision, that they didn't have a choice. But really what they're saying is they do have a choice. They didn't want to be victims to the violence within the spaces, and they want to take control of their own lives. Secondly, and this seems to be taken for granted or not discussed, when we look at the behaviors in the spaces, we also have to examine and contextualize the role of patriarchy in the framing of the rules and behaviors. This is important to remember and consider because patriarchy, and this is not about the idea of patriarchal households or cultures per se, but a specific form of patriarchal concern that frames behaviors and used to validate the exclusion of female and non-heteronormative bodies and support the violence onto those bodies to control in order for the male to become the savior or the king of those spaces and the lands. Over the last 2 days, the discussions have focused on different aspects of gender and organized crime, but there has been an absence in the importance of patriarchy and the role of hypermasculinity in all of this. It's because of this that policy then jumps right into the focusing on statistical data and ignoring theory and jumping to findings and conclusions of what is happening. As such, it ignores how such spaces and behaviors are created, why specific bodies are focused on, and how power is embedded within the structures to validate violence onto other bodies, both by the state and the organized criminal groups themselves. So when we look at this, we need to understand what are the codes that shape the spaces that we're engaging in? What are the behaviors that we're actually looking at? When we look at a lot of policies that have focused on gender within crime, a lot of it focuses on the differences between sex and actually doesn't look at the ways in which the behaviors or gender plays within it. And then the language of gender gets played around within these spaces. And so we need to start moving beyond these sort of sex-based validation or research and data collection to begin to understand what is the role of gender and the behaviors that are that frame what's happening within these spaces. And so I just want to leave it there for now because I do really want to engage in the discussions and the questions with everybody else. And so I just want to say thank you, and I look forward to the following discussion.
Thank you so much, Robert. That was a very grassroots insight into some of the reasons why people find themselves in the situations that they do. And I'm going to be passing on to Jairo Acuña Alfaro now, who will give us some insights from the perspective, from a more international perspective, from a more macro perspective. He is the regional team leader of governance, Latin America and the Caribbean for the UNDP. He has worked on issues of democratic governance and public administration at global, regional, and country levels. He has been UNDP's global advisor on basic government functions, where he led institutional reforms in countries affected by fragility and conflict, and has led the development and implementation of policies and programs for the fulfillment of the Sustainable Development Goals. Jairo has also worked for and with various international organizations, including the World Bank. Jairo, tell us about the UNDP perspective on gender and intersectionality and examples of best practice from the UNDP, as well as perhaps areas that you think we should be focusing on in the future.
Leila, thank you very much for this introduction. And let me start by giving a huge thanks to UNODC for inviting us to participate in this panel, in this discussion. I'm going to change a little bit gears and perspective, as Leila has mentioned, because we wanted to discuss more about the region of Latin America and the Caribbean. And we cannot speak about the region of Latin America on these issues if we don't zoom in the specific zoom regions. And I will zoom in the north of Central America, that unfortunately is a region that we see a spike and a concentration of these gender dimensions of violence and organized crime against women. I'm going to share during my presentation very quickly a few slides that we have prepared. I just wanted to have confirmation that you are seeing the slides now.
Yes, we see them.
Excellent. Okay, thank you. First of all, I think that we start from the starting point that criminal behaviors, organized crime, occur mostly due to weak state capacity and legitimacy, frail rule of law, and an erosion of human rights and social cohesion. I will be developing in each one of these three aspects during my presentation. So how do you deal with these problems that we have in Latin America? Through effective governance. That effective governance becomes the enabler for this that generates opportunities. In this case, and for the issues that we are interested in these conversations, it's about generating opportunities to empower women and girls, to encourage prevention, to deal with violence without impunity, and addresses discrimination and inclusion. Fragile state capacities and legitimacy and frail rule of law in Latin America, in the Caribbean. A few data that we take into account in our own programming and discussions, right? 3 in 4 people in Latin America express a negative judgment about political life in their country. 79% of people believe that their country is governed for the benefit of a powerful few, as opposed to the benefits of everybody. And citizens in Central America, in particular, have a perception of their respective criminal justice systems as very critical, to the point that it's possible to speak of a process of delegitimization of criminal justice in the region. Corruption. The majority of the citizens perceive corruption as the #1 problem. The situation of the Prosecutor General's office and judges might be slightly better, but the majority of the population still attributes to a high degree of corruption to them. 40% of citizens spontaneously point to corruption when asked about the main problem of justice issues. And in Honduras and Guatemala, in the north of Central America, this proportion raises to 50%. 1 in 2 people will say spontaneously that corruption is the main problem in terms of accessing to justice. So one can argue that justice is considered elitist and discriminatory. It works for the benefits of the powerful few and not necessarily for the interests of the many. And unfortunately, what we see is that organized crime takes advantage of these disadvantaged few situations, right? Second issue is the erosion of human rights and social cohesion. And here, the issues of migration take precedence in the region. Criminal groups foster forced human mobility, erodes human rights and weak community roots. And this is, the analysis that we do in terms of these issues of human rights. There are a total of nearly 1 million people that have been returnees between 2016 and 2019 in the north of Central America. The continuing of violence in the region affects women and men differently, and this data also evidence this situation in Latin America. The rate of violent deaths of women per 1,000 women is different than men. And in the case of Latin America as a general, it doubles the world wide average, as you can see here in this graph. In the north of Central America is 4.8, in the world is 2.3. Now, let me see. I mentioned that it's our starting point from UNDP is governance and the effective governance as the generator of these opportunities to empower women and girls, encourage prevention, but progress due to COVID-19 are making this progress also fragile, and we have seen relapses in some issues. Women are killed by people close to them with more cruelty. We have seen a reduction in the overall rate of homicides in Central America, but we have seen a mutation in terms of the types of crimes that are happening in Central America, in particular those against women, violence against women. Costa Rica, Central America, countries continue to have highest rates of femicides, and then we see a lot of pressure to migrate. Drug cartels, in the absence of the state, the organized crimes take precedence. But I don't want to concentrate on the problems also. But I want to focus on some of the issues that we have advanced. And here I want to highlight the very good collaboration that our regional project InfoSegura in Central America has with UNODC and its Center of Excellence in Mexico, where the two of them working together, respecting their comparative advantages, are making progress in the generation of data to measure and make visible violence against women. And I think that this has been a great improvement from 5-10 years ago, when we didn't have that data and this evidence, particularly in these countries. And then we are starting to see important information gaps or new gaps to measure what we want to discuss, that is to make visible violence against women through the life cycle. Our InfoSegura project, through its different partners in Central America, have been making effort to strengthen the development of these evidence-based, gender-sensitive public policies on citizen security with deeper analysis, some of them together with UNODC in partnership with the Center of Excellence, to understand these risk factors and what solutions can be proposed to these areas. And here just a few examples, and with this I will finish, Leila. Issues of strengthening security and justice institutions architecture with tools that contribute to providing more effective responses to instances of violence against women and girls. There are the records of disappearances, that we are trying and supporting institutions of the state to make it gender balanced, right? Human trafficking portal in El Salvador, early warning systems in Guatemala that identified cases and implement protection orders for victims. We are building an index of violence against women and girls in Honduras. There's work with the Judicial Center for Information Development and Statistics in Guatemala to enable magistrates to take action to cut down on backlog in the justice system. Electronic Judicial Documentation Center in Honduras to allow ongoing systematization and sharing jurisprudence, and case file management systems developed in the Supreme Court of Justice of El Salvador. These interventions or these capacity building are made in an effort to reduce the initial perception that I was mentioning in my first slide on how citizens see that justice benefits only the powerful few and not the disproportionate majority of citizens. So all these to say that I think that we have made a lot of progress overall, Leila, in Latin America in trying to understand the problem, in trying to bring the data, provide light to those issues, and now it's time to move on to the next phase, which is the more programmatic, the more solutions-oriented phase. What are the solutions that we can advise? And I think that my two previous speakers have already mentioned some of those solutions, but we need to scale up. We need to replicate in not only in Latin America, but also in other countries and in other continents. Thank you very much, Leila.
Thank you so much, Jairo. That was extremely insightful. And I think our next speaker is going to be able to hook onto that very well. She also has a lot of regional experience, perhaps a little bit different. Professor Sarah Simons, or Simons, apologies for not knowing exactly how to pronounce your name. Just making sure, Professor, that you're there.
I am, and I can hear you.
Wonderful. Professor Simons is an elected member of the Executive Committee of the World Society of Victimology, chairperson of the All Africa Criminal Justice Society, and a focal point for stakeholder engagement for the implementation of the UN Convention on Transnational Organized Crime and its protocols. She's also the Dean of the Faculty of Psychology and Criminology at Frantz Fanon University in Somalia, and has researched extensively in organized crime in Africa, Europe, and Latin America, creating a regional action plan to prevent and combat human trafficking in Eastern Africa and maritime piracy. These are just some highlights. Prof, maybe you can give us some insights into the role of civil society in monitoring gender-related aspects of transnational organized crime.
Thank you very much for this opportunity to be able to chip into the other lovely presentations. I apologize if there's any background sound. There is a mosque just behind me and it's the call for prayer. What I did was I thought I would highlight some of the good practice in engendering mainstreaming gender in the criminal justice system. Because those examples, in my view, highlight the critical nature of making systems more inclusive. And I'll take an approach that looks at different services offered. For example, in the very beginning, in searching homes, one of the very good examples I found was in Nigeria, where they actually legislated through the Administration of Justice of Criminal Justice Act of 2015 that if a home has to be searched, a home in which the women there may be having a provision that they have to be secluded, they cannot be seen in public, what they do is they ensure that all the search teams include a woman, so that they do get the search done, but the sections of the home where the women are observing Parda, first of all, the woman police officer would announce herself and would request to come in, so that they meet less hostility. I also observed the increase in the number of women in the law enforcement. Worldwide, we have a skewed gender profile of law enforcement workers, and with, of course, more being men. But I notice, and I applaud, under UNODC Pakistan Rule of Law program, they have trained the first ever cadre of police officers in Balochistan. And these ones are responders to gender-based violence, in acknowledgement that most of the victims are women. I also acknowledge the role of UNODC Container Control Program, Women's Network, which is promoting women's roles in the programs towards gender equality. Within the judiciary, I found a good practice in trying to even out the proportion of women in the judiciary here in Somaliland, where the Attorney General over the last few years has increased the number of women at all levels of the judiciary, from the judges, the magistrates, and the office clerks, realizing that most of the people coming to court would be women and who would not be able to talk to men if they came to the court, but also realizing that some of the practices, the religious practices here, require that gender disaggregation of staff. Then also you find that in Kenya, for example, they created quotas. Quotas sort of create a level playing field for women to be able to rise to the top cadre in the judiciary. For example, in Kenya, if the Chief Justice is a man, the deputy will be a woman. And this is something they've consistently been able to implement over the years. I also find across the board in many parts of the world, there's more gender-based training of all, GBV training of all staff, so that they're more sensitive to the needs of victims. And here I'm talking about all genders, so that when a complainant comes or they receive a report, they're able to respond appropriately, respecting the person's human right. There is also more gender-sensitive, the more gender-balanced training of search teams by border control. I've seen that in different parts of the world, so that there are more women at border control to be able to do searches like pat-downs and so on, which are very necessary when at the very entry point. And we're talking of efforts to be able to combat organized crime. And in the part of prevention, that is very important. But also on the part of being more proactive, you find that there are more women now involved in intelligence gathering and safely delivering it on different forms of organized crime. So that is on the part of the different functions. Lastly, and I know we will have a further discussion in this, but I find that there are gender considerations in planning the working environment is very important, because that will be able to enable activities and projects to be able to consider that to be more conducive for women to be involved. Because if they're more involved, they're safer, they take into consideration women's needs. For example, if taking into consideration that women have menstruation, and pregnant mothers and nursing mothers can be able to work in those places. And we'll talk a bit about that, I think, later. So worldwide, you find that baby steps are being taken to be able to mainstream women, both in the labor force, as well as considerations of gender within the policies and practice in the actual supply chain of organized crime, countering organized crime services. So I think I'll stop that for now, because I want to be able to I want us to be able to engage more in the question and answer. But worldwide, there's more, but more can be done. Still more can be done, because the same boundaries, the same obstacles in the way of women engaging in professions to counter organized crime still prevail. So thank you very much, Laila.
Thank you so much for this overview on how to make systems more inclusive, more sensitive, and the importance of gender mainstreaming and also including more women. All of those are wonderful insights. I move to Rika Putonen, who is the program manager on the implementation of the Organized Crime Convention for the UNODC. She holds a PhD in law and is a trained judge. She has worked to counter various forms of organized crime, such as trafficking in persons, smuggling of migrants, and more recently, wildlife crime. She is also secretary of the working group of government experts on technical assistance to implement the Organized Crime Convention and the protocols there too. Rika, maybe you can give us some insights into the relevance of gender in the Organized Crime Convention, less explored areas of it, and the work of the UNODC more generally.
Thank you very much, Leila, and a pleasure to be here with you. So as I put up my presentation, here we go. So basically, yes, I will talk about gender in the implementation of the Organized Crime Convention. And to those of you who are not so familiar with the convention, it is one of the most broadly adhered to conventions in the world, with 190 parties. So almost the entire world is a party to the convention. And there is a review mechanism that was just launched. So this is a fantastic opportunity for us to move to the next level in the implementation and mainstreaming of gender in the implementation of the Organized Crime Convention. The momentum is here now. There are a lot of assumptions that we make when we talk about gender and organized crime. One of those very strong ones that we all, to various degrees, have in our heads is that women who participate in organized crime are somehow abnormal or passive participants. This, as such, already leads to impunity. There are many women who've been very prominent in and leaders of organized criminal groups as well. And here you would see 3 women, 3 continents, 3 different organized criminal groups, and all of them leading one of those. What we talk about is agency. Women also have agency, but the exercise of agency is a process shaped by power relations. What is interesting in this example is that we have 2 queens and a kitten here on the picture. Those cases were kind of nicknamed the queen, the ivory queen, starting from the right, the queen of the Pacific, and the Netflix series Queen of the South was kind of loosely based on that story. And kitten was Raffaella Dalterio from Italy, who was the leader of a mafia organization in Italy. All of these names also, I think, portray the way we see women in organized criminal groups. Another bias we see is that men are seen predominantly as perpetrators and very rarely as victims. And Robert was talking about that in detail. We also see that actually in some contexts, in some countries, some locations, men may actually be a lot more vulnerable to certain type of victimization. For example, to be targeted by organized criminal groups to do drug trafficking. They may not have an option, and this is what Robert was talking about. And if they do have an option, it is an option of whether to be victimized or whether to actually participate in an organized criminal group. And that can, as such, lead to secondary victimization if that power structure, that agency question is not taken into account in the punishment part of implementation of the Organized Crime Convention. Here you see a picture, and I would like all of you to think, what is this about? This is another very topical example of how men can also be targeted by organized criminal groups. This is a picture taken in a call center where the employees were targeting middle-aged men for sextortion cases. So it was clearly an organized criminal group, multiple people there working to sextort men in particular. And here you can see the chart. Those employers who made the most money out of those extortion cases got bonuses. And here was their chart, so to say, where they are at. This is from a real case. Another assumption we have, this black and white thinking, is that we are talking about perpetrators and victims. And through these examples, we already saw to a certain degree that these categories are not that black and white. Those categories of perpetrators and victims in organized crime, they don't exclude one another and they can very well coexist. I think Queen of the South would actually be one of those interesting examples if you watch the Netflix series or read about that actual case, because there also the story started with the victimization, and the Queen of the South, so to say, worked her way through the ladder and made herself, put herself in a leading position in an organized criminal group. Also, there is an assumption that only certain crimes are affecting women. And a very classic example would be human trafficking for purposes of sexual exploitation. But there is so much that we don't know because we are not paying attention hard enough. So that's why one of the fundamental starting points for all of us should be to carry out more research. And that's why I'm grateful to my fellow panelists here who have for years already done research. We need to have that research carried out in different parts of the world in a manner collecting gender disaggregated data so that we have a full picture. So what are the results of all these assumptions, false assumptions? The results are policies that deny equity. And those policies that deny equity lead to higher levels of organized violence. So this is a vicious circle. We continue the discriminatory treatment depending on gender under the law in societies and keep on implementing and coming up with new discriminatory laws, policies, and treatment by the criminal justice system. And that has really multiple impacts in terms of implementation of the Organized Crime Convention. It has an impact on the investigation and the use of special investigative techniques. And I'm very grateful to the Pakistani example, for example, where the panelists emphasized the need to have a diverse law enforcement personnel so that we are able to also deal with all groups of victims, witnesses, and possibly perpetrators as well. It is important to have that diversity because if we don't have that diversity, the result can actually be that victims and witnesses are not comfortable to come forward and collaborate with the criminal justice system. And that inevitably would lead to some impunity because our criminal justice systems are still to a large degree dependent on victim witness testimonies. In some cases, lack of mainstreaming of gender in the implementation of the convention even leads to impact on international cooperation, as certain human rights standards require that certain forms of international cooperation, such as extradition, are not carried out if countries can't guarantee that certain fundamental rights are respected there. So there are multiple impacts on the implementation of the convention in order to prevent and combat organized crime. The last example that I would like to give us something positive as well to think about, is that gender roles we see can also be harnessed to institute change. And here I'd like to give a concrete example, a case that is also included in the Sherlock Knowledge Management Portal. It is the case of Lea Carafalo, an Italian mother who was born into a mafia family. And at a certain age, she wanted to leave that life. She got married to a young man from a farming family, but that young man did not actually tell her that he was also a low-level drug trafficker. For that low-level drug trafficker, marrying into a mafia family was like a promotion. So Lea Carafalo and the lower-level drug trafficker then got a child, and Lea Carafalo wanted to leave that life, and she was taken into witness protection. At some point, things went wrong, and she had to leave the witness protection and was kind of bound to return to her husband. Her husband murdered her together with some accomplices, and the daughter had to live through that. There was later on, when the whole story was revealed, there was a public funeral in 2013, which was 4 years after she was killed. And her daughter addressed the crowd. And she very clearly recognized that it was her mother who left that life in an organized criminal group for her sake. She did it in order for her daughter to have a better life, to live out of that context, out of an organized crime, taking hold of everything in your life. And she paid for that with her life. We have to have criminal justice systems which are prepared to deal with those scenarios so that we break the vicious cycle of organized crime. And the time is now to deal with that also in the implementation of the Organized Crime Convention. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Rika. That was extremely moving, and it's also very powerful to hear examples and stories, some of them very disturbing, some of them so hopeful. So thank you for that. And now I move to my last panelist for the day, Professor Maria de la Luz Lima Malvido, transnational organized crime expert at the Instituto Nacional de Ciencias Penales and an expert in victimology, criminology, and criminal law. She has a PhD in law and has written numerous books and articles on victims' rights, immigration law, and female criminality. She was also a sexual offenses and kidnapping prosecutor and the Deputy Attorney General of Mexico, and has been part of a group of experts in the United Nations on topics of violence against women, gender, victim assistance, and organized crime. Maria, thank you so much for being here. Maybe you can share with us some of your insights into your experiences and expertise on the nexus between gender and combating transnational organized crime.
Thank you very much. I will say for the beginning, as I was invited as a panelist in the last moment, so I'm gonna make some comments, very few comments. And I will tell you that in 30 years that I have been in victimology, I saw that most of the people that start working at the beginning in this field were making assistance to victims, but not justice to victims. That's the reason that in the World Society of Victimology, we pushed the declaration for the declaration that is the standard of victims that was approved in the United Nations Congress in the seventh Congress. This declaration of justice for victims was very important because this was one of the main important things that push in our regions that we start growing up for victim assistance, the constitutional amendments. Mexico made a reform in 1993, was one of the first constitutions in the world that put the victim in their place. So I think that many of the constitutions in the world, they haven't moved to have this reform that would be very important, because in the criminal system, the victim has to be part in the procedure. And then I started the first office for victim assistance in Mexico in 1990. It was very first services in Mexico was the first, and I opened it in sexual crimes. In Mexico, we have a dark data, and in all Latin America, of sexual crimes and abuse of children. And that office was extremely good because in one day we have 20 reports, and we really didn't receive at least 2 a day, and then we have 20. That's proof that if we have good services for victims, the dark number will go out. By that moment, we didn't have any methodology to see what about that data. We have in Mexico the Center of Excellence, that is an extraordinary institution that works with the UNODC, and they developed this methodology with Vienna's office for the survey of victimization. And that is very important because in all the region and almost in all the world, this Center of Excellence is pushing that to all the countries to have the same methodology, because if you don't have the same methodology, you would not be able to compare the rates of victimization. In our countries, unfortunately, the victims do not go to make the report. We have 94 point something of the data. So we are just working for 4% of the population that goes to the system. So that is very extremely terrible, because in organized crime, we will have a lot of people that will never go to the system to ask for help. So I'm talking about many victims of organized crime, like all the crimes that our colleague has said in the region. I think that is very important that United Nations in the strategy of UNODC taking care that we have to really develop the different strategies for regions, because the context of each region has their own specificities and according to the vulnerable groups that are suffering. So unfortunately, in our region, the organized crime is growing. We have gender-related killings. We have forced disappearance and kidnapping with the knowledge of the authority. And we have forced recruiting, any human trafficking, and all different forms of exploitation, and also forced recruitment of use of children and the adolescents in the criminal organizations, and for the commission of crimes and massacres of migration and forced disappearance, and the feminization of the migration, that and also they are recruiting children as children soldiers. And we have now a political violence, assassinations of women that are candidates for Congress and mayors. Unfortunately, all this is terrible, but we have to see in which are the best practices in the region and in the world that could be change things and put it in practice in the implementation of the strategy of UNODC. And in gender, we have some good practices. We have some observatories of gender. With this, the civil society is supervising what the government is doing around the area. Also, a lady make a map in Google Map, make the map of the feminicide. And it is very important because she visibilize all these rates of the feminicide. We have in a law that we have in Mexico that is a very good law, the feminist alert. So if in some place or region they are killing women, this a group of the government and different agencies go and make a visit in the place and see what's going on, and they make some recommendations, and they give some funds to push this little place or government to change the strategy and to make some policies, and they change the law or make protocol or something that could stop these killings in our country. And so the NGOs, the civil society, can go to the office of the government and ask that they need this alert of feminicide to be able to stop it. We also have to empower the victim advocacy groups, like the mothers of children who has been forced disappearance, because these all the groups of the community are very strong, because they are pushing the change of laws. In victimology, the victimology is a science, but also is a social movement, because many of the people that are in victimology has been in some moment has been victims. So many of my colleagues of the Society of Victimology were in these camps of concentration camps in the war. So they are sensitized to know what they should do. As an example, I am advising these mothers of the child that has been disappeared, and they told me that there's any knowledge in Mexico to take bodies from the water. So to be able to do this investigation, the research, this investigation, crime investigation, to take the bodies out of the water, they don't have the knowledge, so they don't do it well, so they never will find these bodies. And that is really a way to make new proposals that they could do something new. We have to work in resilience community, because as the global initiative of against organized crime, that I'm part of, this global initiative is working in some places in Sinaloa, in some places that the organized crime this vast, it has do many things and many kills. Just in Chihuahua, one governor asked, how many kids do we have, orphans? And they were 2,000 little boys and girls orphaned because of the kills. So we have to do something with these groups. And I am proposal to also to add a management risk response, not just for the people inside the UNODC, as is said in the strategy, also for the world, for the communities. They need to be educated to have this management response in a crisis. What should they do if they are forced displacements? How they are going to react? Where is the place where they can go? How they are going to put all the set that they need to go out and run. And so we are acting, we have to act like we are in the war, because this is the war. The cartels are getting in government, getting in parliament, are taking places like us, the terrorists. So they are linked, terrorists and organized crime, and develop a new strategies that they are going to attend, I think, to some of the infrastructure. And in our strategy, I didn't saw nothing about the attempts of that organized crime can do to these strategic structures. Because they are going to make some bombs, and they are going to make some really awful things in these places, and we are not prepared as with a crisis response. And I think that the analysis of the structural violence that is causing the macro victimizations, given social, political, economic conditions, we have to study this structural violence of macro violence, because it's different, because it's not a collective violence, it's a structural violence inside the governments, as one colleague says. So I think that we have to follow up the organized crime measurement methodology that Savona was pushing in the Excellence Center of INEGI, UNODC, Mexico, because we have to know how to measure this, the advance of this organized crime. And I think I took so many times, so I will make all the other proposals when you give me the floor. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Maria Lima. Everybody is invited to turn on their cameras. I'm going to kick off with some questions, but please feel free to address whatever has come up during the panel for you that you feel as well that you want to raise, or perhaps address from other people's presentations as well. But in my mind, I would love to go back to some of the things we heard about mindsets, culture, and beliefs, which are some very important things that we need to be addressing along with policy. And perhaps this question could be for Huma and Sarah to look at from your perspectives. You know, you mentioned, for example, it's important to raise the number of women in leadership positions. Is it, you know, what other things do we have to be looking at when we look at women in leadership? How do we perhaps transform the culture of leadership as well? And how can we perhaps combine changes in leadership with changes in you know, efforts that happen at the grassroots, perhaps with various different partners? What are some of your insights and experiences there? Perhaps Huma, you can start.
All right. Thank you so much for giving me the floor. You see, it is very important that we do have inclusive processes. Women do think differently. Their approach is different. But what happens is also that unless and until they are trained, they're well equipped wise, they have knowledge base, they cannot really deliver. As I had said earlier, low literacy rate is one of the major impediments. So unless and until at the leadership level, do you want just to have a woman's body sitting across the table and not being able to deliver? Or do you want to have responsiveness, a gender responsiveness, a human rights responsiveness, if it's a gentleman sitting across the table? So you have to look at those. So how do we train? How do we do the capacity building measures? That is very important that we have those in place, first of all. Yes, increasing the number, we do need to have critical mass, because critical mass does play a role. And I have seen that in the parliament. I have seen that in the law enforcement. I have seen that in so many other institutions. Mindsets are there, you know, like I will just give an anecdote. For instance, we were having this consultation about women police. And this consultation was funded by, excuse me, GIZ. And one of the male police functionaries stood up and said, ever since we have had more women, we have had corruption. And moral corruption he was referring to. And suddenly this senior lady officer, she got up and she just stopped him there. And she gave him her peace of mind and said, hold on, you have served under me. Do you want me to enlist what you have been up to during your career? Just because a few women have been here, they're under training, and you are saying that women have been, you know, doing corruption, and you're talking about moral corruption. And what have you all men have been doing? I have been writing your ACRs, your annual confidential reports. Give me a break. I will start naming all of you. And he had no answer to that. And he had no evidence to prove that also. So these are the mindsets that exist. Women, when they are being trained, even at the police, at the Federal Judicial Academy as well, I was telling them, and when I was designing their programs and trainings, and even at the police, I would tell them to make sure that they also are taught how to carry themselves, because they're coming from their homes directly. You know, their pre-service trainings also, they need to know how to carry themselves, how to conduct themselves. And the men also need to understand that, how to conduct themselves. So these are some of the issues. Now we are talking about increasing the number of women in judiciary. Yes. In police, yes. In policy making, yes. But then you have to sensitize them, you have to orient them, and you have to do all those programs. And they have to be ongoing as well, because there's a great turnover. So we have to do that. And that has to come through media as well, through education at the school level, college level, you know, primary school, I would think. So it has to be a process, as you know, educational level, at their career level, it has to be there everywhere. And that is the way it has to break. Because you just cannot go on, you just cannot say, oh, when women come in, you know, the corruption comes in. Just because you cannot take charge of yourself. You do not know how to, you know, even if as a mark of respect, they say, oh, we don't want to bring our women in the forefront, they might get into trouble. No, they are there at par with you. Let them take charge of the situation and let them deal with the situation. Don't put them behind. So this is sort of things, you know, people have to understand. You know, these mindsets, the cultural mindset, sheer out of respect or sheer out of perhaps the mindsets, you know, those things, they have to be cut. So this is how I see things.
Wonderful. Prof. Sarah, perhaps you can speak to some partnerships that we can think about when we are addressing these kinds of mindsets that Huma is talking about. And I can combine this with a question here that I see in the Q&A. Someone said, a potential solution, how important do we think leveraging traditional and religious institutions is in combating transnational crime? Is it important to appeal to religious representation for advocacy or to take any particular action in this regard? religious groups, what other groups, Huma mentioned media, perhaps even, yeah, stories that are told in the media. What are some of the ways that we can partner to address some of these cultural mindsets and beliefs, Prof. Sarah?
Thank you, Laila. A very good set of questions. I think I'll start by referring our colleagues, our participants, to UN Handbook on Justice of Victims of Crime, justice for victims of crime, because it gives a whole range of entry points and engagement points, which different stakeholders in the community, in society, can engage: media, government officials, schools, and hospitals. I think it provides very detailed guidelines for the declaration on support for victims of crime and abuse of power, but which can be related to other fields as well. So if anyone needs that, I'll put it in the chat after I'm done. But just picking up from what my predecessor Huma just talked about, I agree that women need, in order to increase and retain women's presence in the leadership positions, similar to the one where the senior police lady you've just quoted is. I think we have to be ambitious, and we shouldn't expect it to be easy, because talking about women working in the field of, as professionals in the field of countering organized crime, we're coming into a male-dominated sector. There will be biases that we need to challenge. There will be assumptions that Rika mentioned that we need to challenge. But perhaps one way would be, for example, in our partnerships, to include one of the essential eligibility criteria would be a gender audit, a 5-year gender audit, just like we give our accounts and so on, so that organizations deliberately look at the gender, how they've mainstreamed gender in policy and practice. Because if that is not done, it will just be taken as a token thing, just adding 1 or 2 women in there. And then female leaders also need to try and be, and this has helped me, top achievers within the organization. Talking as an African woman, but also someone who's elbowed her way through culture and elbowed her way to the position I am, I know that there will always be, a woman would always have to prove herself. And why not? I teach, and I don't have a different marking scheme for males and females. The marking scheme is the same whether I'm training police officers, male or female. So one thing I would recommend is that perhaps we could try also and fund strategic professional network development and training, so that iron sharpens iron, so that women can be able to fulfill their role at home, but at the same time, we have access, if we could have sponsorship to e-libraries, e-learning forums, electronic devices, and all the good online courses, for example, that UNODC has put online, so that we can do some of our continuous professional development in safe spaces at home. I think that would be important. But one example I'd like to bring, a practical example, while I was in the UK working in the security field, our union, GMB, did a survey, and one of the things they wanted to find out was how gender has been mainstreamed into the security industry, because we are at public events, we are at the Olympics, we were serving alongside our men, and practical things which make it difficult for women to work in those areas. Were there sanitary facilities? Could you stand down for 5 minutes from your shift to go and change your sanitary? Women who are nursing, if you're working in a police station, is there a creche where you can put your child and, during break, like men, go out to smoke or have a cup, go feed your baby? So I think there are adjustments, not just in policy, not just in mindsets, but in practice as well, because that's where the rubber hits the road. And I think that challenging those assumptions, channeling gender bias is good on paper, but it's also good for organizations to put it in practice. For example, the maritime sector has created the Women Maritime Association and so on that helps to inform policy about that. So those are just some practical things. They may seem very minimal to others, but these are the ones that lock women out of those positions. I'll give a good practice and I'll stop.
Perhaps
One of the areas, for example.
Sorry, Prof, we have less than 10 minutes left, and I have to give everybody else.
Okay.
An
Yeah,
opportunity to
that's
as well.
okay. Yeah, that's okay. That's okay.
So I will, and I know we have so much to discuss. We could probably go on for 2 more hours, and I see that there are conversations happening on the side as well, which is wonderful. Please do make use of that. I'm going to move right on and combine another question from the Q&A with something I want to pick up on with Robert and Rika. One question says, would a change in the structure and language of constitutions, from a perspective, improve the way crimes are addressed? And both of you discussed a lot about discourses on meanings and reshaping meanings and understandings of power, agency, who is a victim, narratives. So how can we reshape not only the content of policies, but perhaps also the paradigms that inform those policies and the way that we go about that? If you can give me a little bit of input, both of you, on that, Robert and then Rika, briefly.
Thank you, Leila, for that. So I was just going through the question box here with Rika when we were having a little discussion real quick here. When I said that I don't think that increasing women specifically will actually change impunity. And I want to just clarify this real quick. There's been studies done here in Canada and North America with the inclusion of Indigenous people into police forces. And what's actually happened is we've never really seen a decrease in Indigenous crime. We actually see increases. And what it is, it's the state itself, right? So just adding people in and saying, oh, we're going to add people and stir it all up and we're more diverse doesn't change the actual structures of the games or the relationships that are going on in there. So as what was said before, it isn't until you get people in positions of authority to make changes and shift in policy that will also be adhered by, then we can start seeing the change. And we do have to engage in this sort of critical discourse and thinking within that. So real quickly with the question, until we start actually having a power analysis within the idea of crime, criminal justice, we actually can't really make too many changes because we need to understand how do people benefit from within these spaces, but also those who don't engage, how does power also support those who just are bystanders? So we have to understand this, and this is where the intersection comes in. If I'm not part of a marginalized group that's being targeted within this, but I'm also not the person who's engaging in that targeting, I still benefit in certain areas because my body and will not be focused on. So until we sort of get that sort of discussion moving in and embraced within the document itself, and that's going to take a lot of time, but I do think that we need to start looking at how do we not just look at gender per se, because when we look at it again within spaces that in Canada where colonization has been really impactful on Indigenous bodies, saying gender and all women are treated the same is actually missing the point that race has a huge impact on the ways in which certain bodies are protected or not protected. And again, just that came out, again, and I don't want to put it all out there, I just saw another question on the idea of religious organizations. Well, in Canada, it just came out again that a residential school that is very close to where I am, they just uncovered a mass grave of over 700 bodies today from the residential school. So when we say religious organizations, we have to also understand the history of religious organizations as being one of the largest criminal organizations that have transported human people over time. And so it's these histories and all of this that needs to come in, and we need to understand these perspectives within all of this. But I'll digress here because I'm looking at time, and I'll let Rika go. So.
Rika, do you have any thoughts that you would like to share? And perhaps in the interest of time, because I'm so sorry that we really only have 5 more minutes, Rika, perhaps you can already incorporate some of your responses to this question, but also some of your final thoughts and key takeaways. Like if there was one thing we should focus on in the next 5 years, what would it be?
Thank you, Leila. Yes, I think linked to the very first question that you posed, I think if there was one word that I'd have to use, I think it would be education. And like Huma also mentioned, really starting from primary, continuing to secondary, going to the tertiary level. And this is what we've done in the Education for Justice program. And I think those some of that material is amazing for that purpose. It's the future generations that give me hope. I think they will change the game. And I've listened to, for example, 3 young male, one from Pakistan, one from Russia, one from Australia, having a conversation in their early 20s. And I would never have heard that sort of a conversation from men in my generation. That gives me hope. So the second thing related to kind of the, you know, where could we make a change? I think a lot of these issues that we've discussed today, you know, the chronic vulnerability, intersectionality, and so forth that Robert was also talking about, it's fundamentally important to understand that and to kind of break away from those assumptions and unconscious biases, and then see also, you know, the now from the perspective of the criminal justice system as a lawyer, you know, those mitigating circumstances, possibly also aggravating circumstances, but really to understand the dynamics, what is happening there. And that is also what the other panelists were talking about. I think that is fundamentally important. And if it happens at the constitutional level, that was one of the questions, that is wonderful. But I think it also can take place at the level of legislation, and perhaps most easy at the level of policies. But then those policies, legislation, constitution, they have to be implemented. And just to close off with what we were talking about with Robert, I think whether to increase the number of women, whether that would reduce impunity in the criminal justice system, I think that's also very culture specific. And I think of certain crimes and how they're being investigated. If there are no female investigators or LGBTIQ investigators in a certain police station, and the victim comes from those genders, they don't necessarily feel comfortable actually telling their story and telling about the crime that they were affected by. So I do think that it's fundamentally important to have that diversity in the criminal justice system. It's not going to eliminate impunity, but in small parts, it can reduce impunity. I do believe that the diversity is important, but it's also very culture specific, and it varies from individual to individual, because it also depends, of course, on individuals' experience with male, female, whatever, non-binary, whatever gender we talk about. So I think that's important. And of course, in my role, the final key takeaway for the next 5 years, I think to really institute change, long-lasting change, mainstreaming gender in the implementation of the Organized Crime Convention in the context of the review mechanism, when countries start actually implementing the observations that come through the review mechanism, that is where we could really start making long-lasting impacts. And that is my hope for the future, together with the young people. Over. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Rika. I have also been informed that we do in fact have another 15 minutes, so I apologize so much for stressing everybody out. But we do have so much to speak about and so little time, so I'm going to move right along and address Jairo and Maria a little bit. Both of you had mentioned the importance of gender disaggregated data. So data is very important. I also heard you speak a little bit about the intersection between the various different mandates of the UNODC. We spoke about addressing corruption, criminal justice, and transnational organized crime, and the fact that these three are actually interlinked. So it has to be a holistic approach. Perhaps, Jairo, you can tell us a little bit about that approach and what you see as cross-cutting areas that we need to address, whether it be in terms of policy or awareness raising or partnerships. And then Maria as well, your thoughts on that.
Yes, thank you, Leila. And thank you. I think that now the discussion is turning out really interesting, you know, for this debate. I think that based on your question, Leila, I think that I think that we need to have a better understanding of the problem and gather better data so we can have better solutions to that, right? I think that that's a #1 priority. You know, we need to continue producing that evidence in a rigorous manner. The problem is that the context is changing very rapidly, at least in Latin America due to COVID-19, right? Where all these issues are either have been exposed, they have been made visible, they were latent. You know, it's not that they are new, they have been there, right? And now these issues have been magnified, right, through the lens of the consequences, the socioeconomic consequences of the pandemic in Latin America. We have to understand better the issues of the relationship between femicides and disappeared women, for instance, right? In Central America, that's one of the major issues, and human trafficking. And I'm going to relate this to a question that has been put on the chat on the issue of migration. The human mobility trends in Latin America have changed dramatically in the past 5 years, right? It's not just the Venezuelan exodus that we have 5.6 million Venezuelans out of Venezuela today. 85% of those are in a country in Latin America, which we didn't have them before. The traditional migration in Latin America was outside of Latin America, but there are 4.5 million Venezuelans in another country in Latin America. So how do we adapt our normative frameworks to deal with these changes that are happening so quickly, right? I think that it's a challenge, and we have to contribute to transform the institutions of justice and security, as you know we have mentioned a lot. We can't continue applying the same recipes, right, to an ill understanding of the problem that we had. The response has to be different, and we need to find that difference if we are going to have an impact. We need to continue working in the promotion of changes of behaviors based in these new masculinities that have been discussed. I think that Robert's point, you know, is very interesting. But the important as well is the transformation of the impunity, right, as a key bottleneck in Latin America and the Caribbean. There are many issues, that have to be addressed, but the opportunity that we have with the pandemic is that these elements that were hidden, or were the hidden face of insecurity and organized crime, are visible now, right? And with this is this: how do we transform the capacities of these institutions to provide solutions that women that migrate should not face the same vulnerabilities that they face? Sexual violence, right? Human trafficking. We know that this happens. How do we transform those capacities and those normative frameworks for the institutions and for the communities to address those challenges?
Beautiful, thank you. Maria, the floor is yours. Some thoughts or feelings and
Yes, I agree that we have to transform all the institutions to have a different approaches, and also the data. The data that you have mentioned is important. In migrants, the migrants that has been dead, we don't have any rates in their countries. They just say how many migrants get in and get out, but nobody see about the people that dies in the frontier, open and external and internal frontier. And there is some international measures that has been made to be able to make this accountability. I want to ask my colleagues that has made some some measures that if we could develop a methodology to make these interactions visible and link them with international standards that has been approved, because we have a victim, a woman that is a girl, displacement, victim, migrant, maybe has a disability, and we have to make some methodology to visible these interactions, and then with that, the prosecutor can see which are the main standards that he needs to apply in the case. So because this interaction, if you just say interaction, but how you are going to take it in the case. And I am training my police to visualize these different interactions, link it with the standards. So to have the reaction in the new methodology. Also, I think that we need to establish a methodology of UNODC to collect the best practices in organized crime, because they asked many countries, send the best practices, but which are the best practices? We need the methodology, and I made a methodology for victims. I could send is 16 typologies, because like that you can compare it very quick, and we will see what is better in one country and another country. As an example, we have now for feminicide, we have a context unit. These context units see the context of with an interdisciplinary group in the victimology, anthropology, to see the context where the feminist has made, because it's not a woman has been killed. Why and how come? Because she was victim for a long time, and then why? Which are all these different things that allowed in this society that has this type of crime. So the context, like in the genocide, you need to see the context as a point. It's a very important point when you see genocide. But now you have to use it for to see the migration. These African groups, in Mexico, we have 6 million African people in the frontier. How they get into, and what about the reaction? What we should do? We don't have any shelters, we don't have any food, we don't have the funds. We are not going to give them the same because we have displacement. In Mexico, we'll need the displacement as a national policy for displacement people, Mexican displacement, and then for the migrants in these groups of Africans and Honduran people that are getting in. So as the colleague says, the Mexico is not prepared to reaction for this. And that's the reason that I also said that we have to push the follow-up of the to measure the organized crime with a methodology that Professor Sabona of Italy has started in the Excellence Center in INEGI and UNODC. I don't know if they know it, but it was an extraordinary start to measure this organized crime. It's not just to see how many kills. It's not just to see, it's many other things that the people that has made all these measures, that is an experts in this, two colleagues that are here, they will see how this methodology could be used to push to create the policy with another view, with this hard data that is different than just with our imagination. And about the actors, I was looking to the World Economic Forum. We have to see the methodology because they have this international, they had a methodology of intelligence that are linked many things and very quick. They produce some maps, intelligent maps, and we can use the methodology of the World Economic Forum. It's very useful. I don't know if you know it. And also we need to react to see what about the ISPAC. Do you know ISPAC? ISPAC that is the International Scientific and Professional Advisor Council of United Nations for Crime Prevention and Criminal Justice. I was in the ISPAC, and this was made in the resolution 45-107. it starts in, it was the link for all the organizations, international organizations that has a status of as a consultant in United Nations. And they are just, what about this pact? This pact was made and was approved by the General Assembly, and it was very useful. We made a lot of different conference with all the NGOs of the world. It was very important. So we need to see parliaments. I think in America Latina, there are some people that are working with parliaments. I was in parliament. I really, when I was there, I presented the law of victims, and I pushed many things because I was really enjoying to be in parliament for at that time. And then the private sector and the religious leaders, because the extremist and the xenophobia is growing. And I think these leaders of religious leaders will help a little, like they are helping in UK to stop the radicalismo. And so the women movement in Mexico and in many places in Latin America is going to radicalize. They are radicalizing all the march, and they are destroying things, and they are even making crimes. And I think that the manifestation, the public march are very good for women, but we have not to radicalize the groups. And many times they are just some people get in to make their own agenda, and we have to stop it. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much. I appreciate that. We're going to do a very tiny speed round now, and I'm going to have Huma, Robert, Jairo, and Sarah, because Rika and Maria, you've already shared your kind of final thoughts. Perhaps the others, 30 seconds, 20 seconds, what would be one key area you would say the UNODC should focus on? One key thought over the next 5 years. Speed round, Huma.
I think they need to continue doing what they are doing, you know, in terms of trainings of, you know, they're doing it, but it has to be in continuity. And judicial sector needs to be explored as well, because that is a very important one. Police, law enforcement is there, they're already doing that, but judicial sector needs to be at least, and sector means sector, it's prosecution, judges, you know, police, everyone put together. So it has to be with the holistic approach.
Beautiful, thank you. Robert?
I agree with what everybody's been saying on the panel here. I think we're moving in the right direction with the UNODC and focusing on gender. I do really think the next 5 years is to really engage in theory in doing this and not just applying policy, because this is what we want to see, and to really understand the implicit roles that hypermasculinity has in shaping the behaviors that we're looking to track, and not just focusing on the body itself, and looking at the intersectionality. So looking at how do we engage this at micro, meso, and macro. So how do we create a policy that can be globally identified, but how can we utilize it at a local level to begin to understand the complexities of race and gender, religion within those sort of spaces. So, but I believe that it's moving in that direction with the leadership that's going forward. So thank you.
Thank you so much. Jairo.
Thank you, Leila. It's difficult to pinpoint just one, and I have 30 seconds, so let me just give you a few. I will go with Maria's suggestion, right? Build that inventory of good practices, right? So it gives us some light in this problem. Second is, you know, to ensure the incorporation of the gender perspective in the institutions and the policies of security and justice, where UNODC has a strong footprint, so to speak. I think that we need to do more analysis, or UNODC should do more analysis with this multi-sectorial focus, you know, based on these new masculinities that Robert has alluded to help us have, you know, more effective solutions, support the transformation of institutions in these issues. And last but not least, you know, I think that, you know, it's work together with other UN agencies in the specific case of Latin America, and as I alluded in my initial presentation, Leila, we have a good collaboration with UNODC through our InfoSegura project. And I think that, you know, when we work together, when we do research together, we tend to have, you know, a better outreach and more engagement from authorities. So I will encourage the two institutions to continue scaling up and strengthening that collaboration, UNDP Infosegura project and the Center of Excellence of UNODC in Mexico City.
Thank you, lovely. And Sarah, apologies again for cutting you off so rudely before. Your final thoughts.
Just to echo what Robert has said, but very briefly, feminist theories of criminality have pointed to the fact that women more women get involved in crime during time of crisis. So I think it's important to apply some theories so as to make sense about the data. That's one. And finally, I think that it's very important to have, after you have the gender disaggregation of data, but also do it by region, because the regional disparities may also play another active role in highlighting why there are more women criminals in one area than the other, or the rise in criminal, like Europol has mentioned, that more women crime during COVID crisis. So more research, but more focused. Can we do systematic reviews rather than just literature review, for example? I'll stop there for now.
Thank you all so much. On behalf of the gender team, thank you. This has been a very enriching and insightful session. We appreciate your input and also the energy that you've put into these discussions. We will all be in touch with some of the recommendations that come out for your review, and have a lovely day, evening, morning, wherever you are in the world. Thank you again. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Bye, Rika.